And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another webinar, this time hosted by the Monetary Policy Institute and the Review of Political Economy. Our special guest today is Malcolm Sawyer, who will be giving a paper on presentation on Kalecki's full employment paper, 80 years later. The paper is available, is published in the current issue of the Review of Political Economy. Before we begin, I do want to point out that I have got my lucky Kalecki coin by my side for the event. To introduce our speaker today, I'm going to call on Jalal Khanas, who's going to introduce Malcolm and Malcolm's talk. Go ahead, Jalal.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Jalal Khanas. I'm an assistant professor at Qatar University. I have been working with Malcolm since 2012 as his PhD student, and I'm still working with him until today, hopefully. Malcolm, as you know everyone, he is an emeritus professor of economics. He used to be at University of Leeds. He's retired now, and he was the founding and managing editor of International Review of Applied Economics. He's an author of 12 books or more and co-editor of over 30 books, over 250 academic journals and book chapters. He also used to be a consultant for the OECD, EU, National Institute for Economic and Social Research, and he worked also on New Direction in Modern Economics with Edward Elgar. His research is mainly fiscal policy, monetary policy, and of course, financialization, as he was also a leading principal for a big project in financialization, economy, society, and sustainable development that was from 2011 until 2016. Of course, his extensive work is very valuable, especially when it comes to the economics of Michael Kalecki, as he's one of the few specialists in this area, which he will be talking about it today. He is also an FMM fellow. He undertakes research on macroeconomics, fiscal policy, monetary policy, nature of money. He has the latest book, Can the Euro Be Saved? The Power of Finance and Financialization. And of course, in terms of the economy of Michael Kalecki. I always call Malcolm the Great Malcolm because I worked with him like really a lot since 2012, and he is very, for me, a very modest person. He every time we have discussion, he brings new ideas and new things. So I'm happy always to be working with him. I guess some of you worked with him before, so I will leave the floor for you, Malcolm. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jalal. Malcolm, if you want to share your screen now.
Is there something on your screens?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jalal, for that introduction. And I have to say, it's been a pleasure working with you over, I hadn't realized quite how long, 11 years, I think now. Yeah, I'm obviously going to be talking about these political aspects of full employment. And I suspect most people here have read it many times over. And I hope I can say something a little bit that might add to that, but although it is, I think, quite difficult to do so. So I want to go through the main parts of Kalecki's paper. It was, of course, published in 1943, and it had been presented in 1942 in Cambridge. So obviously it was against the background of war. And I think of course, against the background of a battle against fascism, and that is in places reflected, I think, in his paper. And it's also, of course, the background of people thinking about what was going to happen after the war and preparations for that it is in the context of the UK in terms of development of the welfare state and so on, which came afterwards, and possibilities of full employment policy. And so I think it has to be viewed in that sort of context. So as it indicates here, this is going to be based on the paper which is in the Review of Political Economy. It was published initially in Political Quarterly in October 1943. And I think in celebration of the 80th anniversary, Political Quarterly have put together a number of papers which they had published over the years which relate to this issue. The paper is, I think, laconic even by Kalecki standards in terms of, I think, in some sense, 5 big ideas in 8 pages. And the paper falls into 5 sections, and here I'm going to focus on 4 of those. And the third section, which was making remarks about fascism, I will make a little bit about, but I'm not going to do that in any substance. I'm not quite sure how much to read into this, but the paper was revised and published in Polish in 1961, and then published in English, both in the selected essays of Kalecki and also in a book with the grandiose title of The Last Phase in the Transformation of Capitalism. But those revisions actually drop two of the particularly interesting sections, or particularly the last section. So the sections, the first one I'm going to be talking about, which was on the notion that effectively there could now be the use of the budget deficit to promote full employment, was widely accepted. And then the last section, which was on his relating to what he called fundamental reforms which would be needed in order to be compatible with full employment capitalism, and then making the remark that if those fundamental reforms were not made, then capitalism basically would collapse. So I'm going to go through it, these sort of 4 sections, and make some remarks about each of them as I go through. I think this first section also has to be read in conjunction with a number of other papers which Kalecki was publishing at around about the same time, and most notably one which was called 3 Ways to Full Employment. And in the 3 Ways to Full Employment, he elaborates much more on the way in which the budget deficit could always be funded, and that it wouldn't have any impact upon interest rates, for example, and that and looking at a number of the other objections against the use of fiscal policy to secure full employment. But in this one, he opens with this rather optimistic statement that a solid majority of economists are now of the opinion that even in a capitalist economy, full employment may be secured by a government spending program. I guess there was a majority at the time, but I think since then there's been a very solid minority, and the majority, particularly in later years, have been very much arguing against that. I think there are one part which tends to be missed in this is that he did have this caveat about the adequate plan to employ existing labour power and adequate supplies in terms of the balance of payments, basically. And in another paper, he talked about the need for there to be reserve capacities in order to secure full employment. So I think we often think of Kalecki as assuming that there was spare capacity in the economy. But I think in many respects here, he does mention, albeit briefly, that there has to be sufficient capacity to employ labour, and that may not be forthcoming. I just want to make kind of 2 other points about this, which I in a way find a little bit puzzling. The first is that Kalecki talked about what we would in circuitous terms call the financing and then the funding of public expenditure. And for the financing of public expenditure, he used this example, which is up on the screen, about suppose that the government pays its suppliers in government securities, and then those securities are used to in circulation and so on. I'm puzzled over why he would use this sort of rather convoluted way, particularly for an audience of political scientists, which was the Political Quarterly was. In some earlier publications, he'd been much more straightforward that in order for government expenditure to take place, it has to be financed by the central bank, essentially. But one of the issues which this indicates is that the securities circulate and then eventually are held, but it also means that the budget deficit effectively is funded by those securities which have been issued and then retained, and that is not monetized. So I'm not sure how we get around, how we think about this in terms that, on the one hand, Kalecki seemed to think that somehow government securities would be used as money, but then at the end indicates that actually the government securities will fund the deficit, and it will typically not be monetized. So we didn't pay much attention to it being monetized. And so this is the end of that quote, and then the point I've just been making about the explanation. He also raised, albeit in this context, in a footnote, about a rising public debt. And in other papers, he talked about the concern about the debt level as a result of wartime budget deficits, which in the UK at that time were running about 25% of GDP. And he did pay some concern to reducing this debt ratio. I'm puzzled over why he was so concerned about it, although all I can think of that in the context of debates over wartime finance, this was raised as an issue in terms of what the debt would be after the war. But what is interesting here, I think, is that his solution to that, or the approach to it, was to have an annual wealth tax to reduce the debt. And this has, I think, to some extent, has come back. This sort of notion of using a wealth tax to reduce the debt, at least is on the fringes of some political debates in the UK, although quickly stamped on by any politician. But what he didn't look at was the idea that, well, after the war, the debt ratio would just decline as the deficit declined and as GDP grew. And I don't, in some sense, understand why he didn't go in for that. I'm sure algebraically would have been easy to look at. So in terms of the first part, I think he very much was concerned with the financing and funding of budget deficits, and in other papers confronted the issues which arose over the running of budget deficits. The second section is resistance to full employment, and as I think it, in some sense, maybe the best known of the sections of this paper, looking at the capitalist objections to full employment and the ways that might be removed. As an aside here, in section 3, Kalecki also looked at the way in which fascism functions as a way of removing capitalist objections to full employment by disciplining workers and having an authoritarian state and so forth. In a paper which he wrote in 1964, Fascism of Our Times, he was concerned over the rise of some far-right groups in France and in Germany at the time. But he also linked that with Goldwater in the US, who some may be old enough to remember was running against Lyndon Johnson in the 64 presidential election, and in some ways was seen as a kind of forerunner for Reagan, or preparing the way for Reagan. And he included what he called Goldwaterites amongst those fascist groups. I think it probably was a misuse of the term fascism, but what it was particularly that he indicated there was the notion of the attack upon workers' rights that would involve, and he placed it in that sort of context. So we know the resistance to full employment comes from this the dislike of government interference in securing high levels of employment. This, depending upon the so-called state of confidence, which particularly affect private investment. And I think in retrospect, some of this notion about the role of confidence has played really quite a large role in objections to various forms of government policy. It may not come under the term confidence, but it would be, oh well, the investors won't like it, or the financial markets won't like it. And so that sort of notion that there's a constraint coming from what the effect of a loss of confidence would be. And so it says here, the social function of the doctrine of sound finance is to make the level of employment depend upon the state of confidence. And I think that's, we've obviously seen a great return to the doctrine of sound finance, or austerity, or fiscal consolidation, whatever might call it, sound money sometimes. And it's the way in which that links the level of employment as being dependent upon what is happening with investment and confidence, and gives much more power to investment here, but also I think much more generally to financial markets. The second is this dislike of the direction of government spending. And mass consumption is much more violently opposed by those experts than public investment. And this moral principle of you should earn your bread in sweat unless you happen to have private means. Again, I don't know how much we should read into this, but it seems that an element of this now comes through in terms of the promotion of the so-called golden rule of public finance, whereby public investment can be financed by debt, by deficit, but in Kalecki's terms, mass consumption should not be. And I think there's an element of this, well, somehow borrowing for social welfare or whatever is somehow a bit despicable, and it's much better to focus on public investment. So I think there's an element of this still comes through, although perhaps not as strongly as it's stated by Kalecki. And then there's this dislike of the political and social social and political changes resulting from the maintenance of full employment. I think we also have to, in a sense, link this with the last section of the paper, which Kalecki had then cut out cut down in later versions, but that the maintenance of full employment is going to require fundamental reforms, but those fundamental reforms are likely to be blocked by this dislike of the social and political changes which will come from the maintenance of full employment. So I'm now moving on to section 4, which is the political business cycle. Of course, in his work in the 1930s, he very much looked at the capitalist economy as one of business cycles. And I think his view was that with an increase in government expenditure and so forth, some Minsky sort of argument that the booms and slumps would continue, but on a much reduced scale. But that the actions of government would now also have a role to play in that in the generation of the cycle. And as he basically sort of argued that in effect, prior to elections, or prior to the prospect of elections, government expenditure would be boosted to boost employment, but then that would run into the resistance of the capitalist class, and then so after the election there would be the downturn, or at least the withdrawal of the demand, or slowing down of government expenditure. But he also noted, writing later on, that in nearly all capitalist economies, counter-cyclical intervention and increases in government expenditure always take place in the face of very strong opposition from various groups and so forth. And I think that's that element there is maybe particularly significant. I think we've seen it to a great deal in the way in which the debates and so on went after the global financial crisis, and the arguments for fiscal consolidation and for austerity. And there, and I think I'll probably make this point a bit later on, the resistance was coming to the use of fiscal policy to stimulate demand, rather than to the maintenance of full employment. So even to get back to full employment, there was this resistance to increases in public expenditure or in deficits and so forth. So this is just a quote from Peter Chrysler and Bruce McFlane on about the way in which the ideas of Kalecki fed into a form of political business cycle. And I remember in my youth where it was still the idea that there was this business cycle which was very much in line with the electoral cycle, that there was the boom and bust, and the boom came before elections and the bust came after it. But I think the notion which Kalecki had of the political business cycle was rather different from the ones which came under that title later on. And the particular example I give here is the Nordhaus, but it's the idea which fed into the political business cycle in terms of the government would stimulate demand prior to the election, unemployment would fall, there would be a delayed action on inflation, but the inflation will come after the election and the fall in unemployment will come before. And this was given to so that governments were going to be kind of overinflating the economy to secure re-election, and then the inflationary consequences followed. So Nordhaus described Kalecki as the only serious theory of the political causes of the business cycle. And I think he saw there that Kalecki's model, assuming that business leaders and capitalists have a disproportionate control of the political mechanism. It is the unrepresented nature of the political system which causes Kalecki's political trade cycle. So I think this was a very different mechanism to the one we saw later on in terms of this, well, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and the temptation of governments to reflate ahead of the election and so forth. And there's a quote here from Mitchell, which is not so much that politicians who initiate and manipulate the electoral cycle. This is the capitalist class which manipulates the economy and politicians. And of course, Kalecki only envisaged that under this system, full employment would only reach to the top of the business cycle. But I think one other aspect which comes through in a number of places in Kalecki, but not, is that it's much more the rentier class that would be suffering from inflation rather than capitalist firms and wages. I mean, if wages and prices are rising at pretty much the same rate, so there's inflation, it would, the extent to which interest rates were not rising, then it would be the rentier class that would be suffering. So he therefore also sees in places it's the conflict between the rentier class and the rest as much as between capitalists and workers. I think I would suggest that the generation of cycles through government policies in the light of elections has been very much kind of reduced. Maybe still the case, at least in those countries where you can choose the timing, the government can choose the timing of the election, to when the economy is good, you go, as it were. But I think it is the notion of this sort of business that could be much reduced. And as indicating here, I think the experience of the last 15 years has been much more on the blocking of the use of fiscal policy to offset recession and austerity under various guises, such as reduce the debt ratio, which is the current core lease in this country. The last section for the paper is on fundamental reforms, and I want to talk about this at a bit more length than is actually in the Kalecki's original paper, or even in particularly in the reprint, the revised version, where much of this was dropped. And he spoke about full employment capitalism will, of course, have to develop new social and political institutions which reflect the increased power of the working class. If capitalism can adjust itself to full employment, a fundamental reform will have been incorporated in. If not, it will show itself an outmoded system which must be scrapped. I think here, Kalecki doesn't really say what would be regarded as fundamental reforms, or what would be the type of reforms which might reflect the increased power of the working class. I think we've maybe tended to interpret this in terms of notions of the development of the welfare state, a more social democratic structure, some degree of public ownership, the sort of changes which occurred in much of Western Europe. And I think one could look, at least in retrospect, to say that these social and political institutions didn't really reflect the increased power of the working class. They didn't involve the working class in decision making. And whilst some elements of the welfare state did increase I think the power of the working class and did benefit in terms of some distribution of income, it didn't, in a sense, I think, really reflect the increased power of the working class, nor did it, as it were, create institutions which would enable that increased power of workers not to feed through into wage inflation, which I suppose one could interpret what eventually happened. And this is quoted in a paper in 1946 where Kalecki, whether a possible tendency of trade unions to raise wages in full employment will relieve wages faster than productivity and so on. And he says, well, that would depend on the institutional arrangements of the regime of full employment, which I take to be that there had to be ways in which the wage bargaining and wage determination system had to incorporate the increased power of the workers, which would result from full employment, without that generating rising inflation. But he argues, let's give it a try, and as we did to some extent. So here I just make the point that this fundamental reforms says little about the nature of those reforms, which would be needed to reflect the increased power of the working class. I want to look at this in two respects. The first is to look at a paper which Kalecki published in 1942 called The Minimal Essentials for Democratic Planning, which has not been widely seen, and it's, I think, very difficult to actually find an original copy of it. At least I couldn't find it. Unfortunately, it was reprinted in a book on economic planning, which Jan Toporowski was involved in putting together in 1986, and it's also in Kalecki's now collected works. But this puts forward a much more extensive set of reforms involving, as it were, democratic planning, as he called it, and but with workers involved in the planning, so some degree of worker involvement. And he came back to those sort of issues in the debates in Poland in the late 1950s, and he sketched the main features of his approach, which was based on some form of economic planning. I don't think it wasn't the detailed central planning, but it was perhaps more like the indicative planning, which France and elsewhere went in for, including the nationalization of important enterprises. So public utilities, of course, did happen, but not financial and industrial in the main. And the coordination and direction of their activity by a central institution of economic planning responsible to Parliament. Full public control over banking and finance, investment and foreign trade, and possibly the allocation of basic raw materials and commodities. So quite a detailed sort of, well, not detailed in the sense of setting out how exactly it would be done, but an extensive form of planning, and with involvement of workers in decision making, and what he would call a democratic planning. But this was, I think, much more than is usually suggested by the notion of fundamental reforms. Although I think Kalecki, when he was writing it in this paper in 1942, did remark in similar terms about the resistance of capitalists to these sort of changes. But I think I would argue one could think in terms of these fundamental reforms as being along the lines indicated here, which would be much more extensive than the development of the sort of welfare state and so forth. So this is much more control of industry and planning than it is to do with perhaps income distribution and social insurance. So this is a couple of quotes about the establishment of full employment and about self-confidence amongst the workers and engaged in heightened tempo of social change. Again, I think some of these issues come back in the political aspects of full employment, but the sort of issues which Kalecki was putting forward here would, I think, have raised a great deal more resistance than the rather mild forms that took place after the war. The second point to make is that Kalecki himself, in conjunction with Kalecki, in a paper which was published a year after Kalecki's death, returned to the issue of capitalism and where they used the term crucial reform. And there they argue that what crystallized was a capitalist system of large corporations with supplementary market guaranteed by government purchases, mainly of armaments, and that's a kind of theme that Kalecki often refers to, the role of armaments, which allowed the realization of accumulated profits. And there they seem to suggest that some of the fundamental reforms or the crucial reforms had been carried through, and that there had been some reforms, and there they talk about it's been possible to limit unemployment to a few percent, and there's been a transformation in their view of the working class in terms of their attitudes towards capitalism. In retrospect, one of those cases, it was almost precisely the wrong time to publish this, as it were, just before the end of the so-called golden age of capitalism. So, and Kalecki himself returned to this in 2004, saying that in 69-70, Kalecki tended to be over-optimistic. True, at the end, it says, at the end of his consideration, Kalecki admitted there were some signs of future destabilization could be seen, but these were rather weak. So I think in the end, as John King has argued, the crucial reforms were beginning to unravel by 1971, and he lists the 5 aspects there which he saw as being part of that crucial reform. And so that at the time when Kalecki was, or just after Kalecki died, then insofar as there had been fundamental or crucial reforms which had to some extent increased the power of unions and so forth, and had been compatible with full employment in a number of countries, these were about to start unraveling. Speaking from this country's point of view, that era of full employment really came to an end in about 1966, when there was a deflationary budget to try and address some balance of payments issues. But from then on, I think the full employment era really came to an end. And I think we can now, we could go back and then, I think, interpret what has happened since as being the unraveling of some of those fundamental or crucial reforms, or at least the introduction or the bringing back of a much more anti-worker, anti-trade union environment, a much more hire and fire mentality and so on, which has weakened the workers, so that the crucial reforms that, or fundamental reforms which Kalecki thought would be needed, were to some extent brought in, but in the end they sort of, I think, effectively saying not collapsed exactly, but were not able to accommodate full employment and the effects of that with a promotion of the interests of workers, but rather we have the neoliberal era coming about, which takes us back to a much more let's say hire and fire market orientated system than Kalecki would have envisaged. And there's a quote here, I think, it's a quote here from Bob Rowthorne, which again indicates the prediction of the turn toward monetarism, as he calls it here in the OECD during the 1980s, following the era of the 1970s. So I think just make two sort of concluding remarks. Kalecki opened the political aspects with his optimism that economists agree about full employment being secured through government spending. And indeed, I think put forward many of the arguments that as post-Keynesians we've been familiar with making. However, I think Kalecki was far too optimistic that economists would be persuaded of the usefulness of fiscal policy and not scared off by deficits and debts. And that the political and social forces of capitalism and rentiers were the prime obstacles to the achievement of sustained full employment, but they were aided by mainstream macroeconomists who were convinced of the benefits of fiscal consolidation and austerity. And the second is that from the mid-1970s onwards, of the era variously described as the neoliberal era of globalization and financialization saw reversals of the social democratic changes of the golden age of capitalism, and the various measures to reduce the power of workers, to increase the power of finance, and so that capitalism was evidently unable to sustain the fundamental reforms, or rather shifted maybe to a quite different direction of what those fundamental reforms were, of a return to markets and insecurity. One final remark. I think this is perhaps doesn't follow on directly from the paper, but I think we are in a way faced with a much more drastic situation than Kalecki faced or others faced in 1943, that of global warming, loss of biodiversity, and environmental degradation. Once again, we will require major social and political transformations, and we can only hope that capitalism is more successful in making the necessary transformations than it was in meeting the challenges of unemployment. Thanks.
Thank you, Malcolm. If you want to stop sharing.
Will do.
There you go.
Yeah, okay.
So thank you very much, Malcolm. And it was a very good paper. And I wonder if at the end, even your last slide is a bit too optimistic. I mean, if we accept this argument of polycrisis, and I guess you were touching upon that too, it makes the situation all the more dire than, in a way we could argue that, well, Kalecki was, only had full employment on his mind, but today we have a lot more than just full employment. And I think that's what you were getting into in your last slide. And, maybe fiscal policy is not, I mean, I don't know what the solution is, but I think it requires a lot more than some fiscal policies. Okay. Yeah. So we're going to open up the floor to some questions. If you do have a questions, please, hello, Joël, please raise your hands, and I will, I'll go to you. So no one has any questions? Any questions in the chat room?
I would have one.
Ricardo. Yes, Ricardo.
Yes, I am not sure I understood all the English, so I apologize if I misinterpret. The best way is maybe to very quickly give my story. The Kalecki of the 43 is answering the question, is capitalism compatible with full employment? The answer is no. It could be compatible only temporarily. And he analyzed a couple of situations. The Nazism, of course, on one side, and on the other, the business cycle idea. He could have considered France, but he didn't, because in France, the Blum government intervened on social policy, so it was a completely different story. Then there is the Kalecki of the 1970. I apologize because I am Italian, and I know that the article had to be published in Rinascita. It was submitted in 1970, was against the line of the Communist Party, but Kalecki was friend with Antonio Pesenti, and it was published with an introduction there. There the article is Kalecki and Kovalik. The point about crucial reform. Here my problem may be with Malcolm, but maybe with everybody, is that when I read that article, I see something completely different than what is told in the literature. The article answers the question if there has been a fundamental reform in capitalism, making possible a permanent full employment. This time, the answer is yes. The working class is more reformist, but Kalecki and Kovalik are not happy at all. If you read the article, the point is, I put it bluntly in a ridiculous way. How and from where can revolution come? Intelligentsia, the student movement, and the third world, which are not included. It was very compatible with the monthly review perspective. So it was not something that is so positively. I am very much a 1943 Kalecki guy, not a 1970 Kalecki guy. But there is a third Kalecki which is relevant. In Italy, a lot of Kalecki was translated when I was very young, including 2 articles in Polish on the United States that were later included in the Osiatinski in the 90s, seventh volume. There are 2 articles on the US. One, I think, was 56, and the other was 56, one. The other, 62. They are very interesting because there, Kalecki says that actually in the United States, you don't need fascism or Nazism. You don't need the business cycles, the Kaleckian business cycles, because Cold War, the psychology of monopoly capital, etc. Kalecki writes in a very third international way, control the working class. So there, in a sense, a kind of fundamental reform had already been realized. This is Kalecki. All the things that I've read by John King, Bob Rothorn, all people that I admire very much, that are talking about a Kalecki who would be very happy of a conciliation very radical, of course, a very radical reformism about the fundamental reform is not, in my view, the true Kalecki. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but that's just my take.
Thank you, Riccardo. Malcolm, do you want to reply?
No, I think one of the things which I didn't, I think, bring in, certainly not today, but and really not in the paper, is this, which I think Riccardo picked up on, which is the Kalecki and the role of armaments expenditure in the context of the US, and that was, I think, an important, for him, very important line of argument, very much applying to the US. But I think the US at the time didn't really secure full employment, though, did it, during the 1950s. But I think he did, as you say, place a lot of emphasis on armaments.
Thank you. John Smithen has a question.
Yeah, I had trouble in unmuting myself as always. So thank you for the paper. No, I actually relied on that Kalecki paper for many years. The version I have is in the selected essays, so the truncated version. So I'm very interested, in your point that there's more to Kalecki than that, and you might want to sort of elaborate further on that later. But I still have that book, by the way. Here it is, and it's inscribed "The Property of John Burbage." So, you socialists will be, and communists will be proud to realize I expropriated the capitalist John Burbage, and that remains to this day. Anyway, what I got from the truncated version was this: the premise was an alliance between rentiers and big business against the workers. Okay, and that was understandable. Then in 1984, there was Jeff Ingham's book, Capitalism Divided, which I know you're familiar with. The premise there was rentiers versus entrepreneurs. So to me, Jeff's book was highly relevant, to the circumstances of the early 1980s, the Thatcher-Reagan era. And the key thing that I got from it, and I've sort of run with ever since, is that it seems to lead to different possible alliances. And I think you did allude to this. In North America, we would say Wall Street versus Main Street. Main Street being business plus workers, Wall Street being the financial sector. That's the new thing. So what I have, and what I think I would like you to comment on, I mean, you're a Kalecki expert, you've been working on this for many years. How do you see that sort of shift from in the 1980s? What did you think of Jeff's book, for example, which to me was highly influential?
I think reading Kalecki, there seems, in some places the seems to be it's capitalists against workers, and in other places it's rentiers against capitalists and workers, sort of thing. In terms of these, kind of the place I think where, in a sense, who loses from inflation? Well, it's the rentiers, not because it's depending on, of course, how it goes. But if workers are able to defend wages and then firms just push up prices, so there's a conflict between rentiers and capitalists, I think. So I suppose I don't find the kind of what is the clear line of it. But I think, but then I think the point, the Jeff Ingham, and then sorry, the whole of the financialization literature, and which also was Paul Sweezy and others, that was a major development, which I think not supersedes Kalecki, but I don't think there's much in Kalecki about the power of finance. I think compared with what came afterwards, anyway. So I think one has to, at least I would interpret the financializations, but as well, to some extent, it's just moving on, as it were. And there are aspects of financialization which can be fitted into that Kalecki's, but I think particularly over things like the share of profits or the share of the surplus and the and so forth. But I would think it's very much I can't say it's a post-war development because financialization was going on before, but I think Kalecki doesn't have I don't think has a really great deal about the power of finance, although there's aspects about the interests of the rentiers, and then issues about I suppose what the supply of capital, supply of funds, and principle of increasing risk and so forth. But I don't think it doesn't really develop the power of finance. Although, having said that, what I should go back and look at is what he was writing in the 1920s and 1930s, when he was looking at the rise of cartels and all this stuff he was writing in Poland prior to the war. You ought to go back and look at that in terms of what was the power of finance in the rise of the cartels, but that I haven't done recently anyway.
Thank you. I have a quick question, and I think this is something that I put to you in an email at one point. For me, I also see the central bank playing a role against this idea of reaching full employment, which I don't think Kalecki mentions. But today, currently, with interest rates going up, we see, and with governors saying we need to have pain, we have to inflict pain on the labor force. Couldn't we make an argument that this is involved in Kalecki's analysis as well?
I suppose one would say I think it's probably not incompatible with, in terms of obviously it's been a shift for the way in which monetary policy is now operated is much more directed towards inflation, and also then directed towards pain and austerity. So that so it's the central bank which is now operating that discipline, or seeking to operate that discipline, rather than say through fiscal policy. But given that the central bank is the bank of government, but also the bank of bankers, so in terms of it's going to reflect financial interests as well, so that it is, I would say, on the whole, promoting the interests of the financial sector. So that but yeah, I think in terms of disciplining workers, that in a sense is I think it's probably been fairly explicit in the last year or two. That comes through interest rates now.
Thank you. If anyone is interested in doing an application of Kalecki's work on central bank policy and austerity, I'd be very interested in publishing that. Next question, Steve Pressman.
Thank you, Malcolm, for both a wonderful presentation and a wonderful paper. I've got a question that I've wanted to ask many times in different venues, but haven't had the courage to do so until now. I've always read Kalecki's essay as, in some sense, like a forerunner of public choice. And there is a lot of that in the essay, and I heard a lot of that in your presentation. On the one hand, Kalecki wanted a whole bunch of reforms that would enable economies to reach full employment. But the beginning of that essay is really very public choice oriented, in the sense that nothing will be done because the capitalist interests pretty much control the legislation that's passed. So my question is really, I wonder what you think of this.
Yeah, I guess in this 1942 article I referred to, I think that probably those not so much over public expenditure, but that resistance comes through rather more than perhaps in the later one. Yeah, I think then I think all I could say is that in his policy discussions, Kalecki was always saying, yeah, public investment must be useful, and not just do it because it creates jobs, sort of. So that, but he was also sense, arguing in places that the form of that public investment would be to some extent constrained by the capitalists, because there would be some forms they would like to undertake because it's profitable, but there are other forms which they would kind of object to. And I think to some extent we've seen that play out, at least in the UK, in the sense that there's been a much more promotion of private involvement in public investment through public-private partnerships or private finance initiatives, so that the profitability of public investment is enhanced so far as the capitalists are concerned, and indeed it's become a much more expensive way of undertaking private investment, public investment. So I think if your argument is that the direction of public investment is going to be heavily constrained by what is profitable and what is in the capitalist interest, then I think that's right. And but I think Kalecki would kind of kick against that, as it were. But he would, I think, referring to, back maybe to some extent the point that Ricardo was, that the promotion of armaments is not just because of any control features, but it was a particularly profitable undertaking for the private sector. So yeah, I think the direction that public investment actually takes is very much constrained by that. I can't imagine that Kalecki would have liked that very much.
Thanks, Malcolm. Steve Pressman, if I had been quicker, I would have done a drum roll when you said you've never had the courage to ask this question. Maybe I'll put one in post. Speaking of new schoolers, Ron Kalecki.
Yes, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, basically, from your presentation, I kind of understand Kalecki's thought as there has to be a reserve army because we have to have an economy where you set the going wage. And so my wonderment is whether Kalecki had a thought of what we consider the living wage, social reproduction kind of adequacy. Where did he see that in the schema? That's the question, I guess.
Yeah. I think, yes, I mean, I think Kalecki had implicitly a sort of industrial reserve army sort of perspective. I think in effectively the real wage is determined by what the capitalists do. That is, the relationship between prices and wages depends upon the pricing decisions from the degree of monopoly. So whether that results in a living wage or not really depends on the degree of monopoly. So it's very much no, I'm sure there was going to be all sorts of limitations on that, but effectively, I mean, Kalecki in places has that. Well, this is what the money wage is. Then the capitalists put a markup on that, and that then sets the relationship between prices and wages. And that's then the real wage. Now, clearly,
so the employer doesn't have to pay for productivity improvements.
Not if they can get away with it. It depends on the relative bargaining power of the two sides. But yeah.
Okay, I've got a question in the chat room from Carlos Marentes. Thank you for the presentation. In consideration of what you have said here today, then would it be necessary to rethink the notion that Kalecki anticipated some of Keynes's position on full employment? Or are these two views still compatible and only dependent on what time period Kalecki we read?
Well, Keynes and Kalecki were developing their ideas at pretty much the same time. One can argue for Kalecki being ahead of Keynes in the sense of identified publication, I think, in 1933 with the ideas of effective demand and the role of investment and so forth. I would have, because one could say one of the differences, well, first, this might be a minor difference. I don't know. Kalecki, in places, argued that in most countries, a full employment would require a budget deficit. There was a general deficiency of private sector demand, which had to be filled in by the budget deficit. So he argued for a permanent, a long-term budget deficit. On average, there would be a budget deficit, and I indicated he did today that he was concerned about the debt ratio, and he did to some extent address that in terms of would if there's a continuing budget deficit, would that not lead to the debt rising or debt ratio rising? And if it did, well, let's bring in a wealth tax for that. Whereas I think Keynes, as I read it, didn't think that a budget deficit would be always required. He would let the budget deficit move plus and minus. Although in one place he did talk about effectively using public investment to fill the gap between private savings and private investment. But Kalecki, for example, also criticised there's in the UK a white paper on full employment policy after the war, and criticised them for saying, whilst there would be cyclical fiscal policy, the budget should be balanced, and arguing against that, and that there was a need for a long-term budget deficit. So that's one sort of difference. But I think the other difference, which I think maybe comes out in these political aspects, is you could always say that Keynes would rely on the power of ideas, whereas Kalecki would rely on the power of politics and social forces and so forth. So that Keynes had, you could say, to some extent, had the if people were informed enough and intelligent enough, then we could have full employment. Whereas Kalecki said, yes, if we're intelligent enough, we could have full employment, but there's going to be a hell of a lot of obstacles to obtaining that.
Thank you. A quick comment by Riccardo Bellafiore before we go to the next question. Riccardo was asking, government deficit financed by government bonds?
Typically. Or funded, I should say, funded.
Yeah, okay. Good. I have one question, and then we'll go to Jalal for the last question. This is from someone, Bruno Sevilla in Mexico, who basically says that Kalecki's analysis is quite restricted to understanding problems like full employment only in developed economies. What do you have to say, Malcolm?
I think that Kalecki would probably agree with him. Well, in that he did portray the planned socialist economies of Eastern Europe as resource constrained. Capitalist economies were demand constrained, and then developing economies would often be would have basically a lack of productive capacity. So there are different issues. So, but I think it's always the issue that we're only looking at the demand side. Well, got to bring the supply side, or at least the productive capacity into account. I did make that remark about that there is a little bits in Kalecki. We talked about the need to ensure there is sufficient productive capacity, and that I think if one was looking at it, well, maybe all economists, which are, but particularly developing economists, then there's the need to develop that productive capacity in whatever way. So, yeah, there's always that limitation that if we're looking at a demand side perspective, then one tends to be almost like assuming, well, there's going to be sufficient capacity. Well, very often there isn't, and all
Thank
the
you.
institutional arrangements as well.
Thank you, Malcolm. The last
Louis-
question to Jalal.
Louis Philippe, may I do my question?
I asked your question.
Yes, because I was not online before. This point about budget deficit and government debts issues, which are funding that, etc. I am asking myself if what Kalecki is saying, I'm not either supporting or denying it, is that there is no need to a monetary financing from the central bank, but that government bonds raise the velocity of circulation. So you don't have a rise in the direct emission from the central bank, but you have an increase in the velocity of circulation. So you don't need that. There is this expression that Kalecki uses here and elsewhere, that these are technical details and that the budget deficits does not need to be financed monetarily from the explicitly, so to say.
Yeah.
I hope Malcolm can clarify.
Maybe it's just my interpretation, but and looking with the benefit of hindsight or whatever, but I would always want to make this distinction between, in Secretary's terms, initial finance and final finance, and that money, and in this case, central bank money, is required for the initial financing, but not for the final financing. To what extent the final financing may be used as a bit of money is a sort of monetary policy decision in effect.
Thank you. Jalal, for the last question.
Okay. First, thank you, Louis Philippe, for organizing this. It was great, and to invite us all, and for this deep reading in Kalecki from Malcolm. Actually, I have a question. I'm not sure if it's a very smart question, but for my understanding from I mean, the definition of full employment, I guess Kalecki has different view of what we have in mainstream views. So how we can see full employment from Kalecki, it's more union power, democratic solutions, etc. So I'm not sure to what extent these differences are there. I mean, how can you explain it, Malcolm?
Well, I suppose I don't know whether we want to put it this way in terms of, if it's a mainstream view, then you get full employment if market's clear, the labour market's clear. In Kalecki's terms, but that market clearing is probably, well, if it corresponds to some sort of so-called natural rate of unemployment, it probably doesn't correspond to what we would regard as full employment. And Kalecki, firstly, in a sense, he doesn't discuss what is meant by full employment. And I suppose he was writing in the era where, on the whole, males and maybe and single females were the workforce, and they either worked a full time week or they didn't work. So in that sense, it was quite easy to define full employment. Maybe some sort of like beverage type explanation where the number of people that were actually recorded as unemployed is equal to the number of vacancies, something like that. I think it's much harder now to define precisely what we mean by full employment. Is it people working the number of hours they want to work, or what are the constraints on that, what age groups and so on will be included. So I think it's much more difficult now to define full employment, and then more difficult to actually, but in that sense, reach it. I think Kalecki, this is what I think that the achievement of full employment would come from there being sufficient productive capacity and sufficient demand, and we've gone into all the obstacles which there are to the achievement of that. But that full employment does require, at least I interpret it, does require, it's like an industrial and regional policy to ensure there's sufficient productive capacity, then sufficient demand, and all the other factors which, in terms of the political, overcoming the political and social constraints to full employment.
Thank you. Well, let me end by thanking Malcolm for his presentation, Jalal for introducing the guest, thanking those who asked questions, and then everyone else who attended. Thank you very much. I will be this video will be available on YouTube probably by the end of the day, and I will be sending a link on various social media platforms.
Thank you for your discussion, and this is the advantages of Zoom these days, I think.
I think so. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good to see everyone.
Bye.
Bye,
See you.
Glenn.